because they're recording this evening. So welcome, everybody. It's 6:35. I figure we'll start. I do want to begin with a land acknowledgement before we jump in. So because the Nickel will be operating from both an on-site and online space this year, viewers will be joining us from various points around the world. We encourage you to take a moment to consider the place where you are currently located and to acknowledge the Indigenous people who were the original caretakers on the land that you're on. The Nickel would like to acknowledge the land on which we are based as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture is now lost forever. We acknowledge the island of Katamuk, Newfoundland, on the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. We acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Innu and Nitassinan, the Innu of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatuhavut. We are grateful to live and work on this land with all people, those indigenous to this place and those from all over the world. We are committed to opening our hearts and minds to the past and to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make the future better for all. And thank you. That's a great acknowledgement. Welcome, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with so much talent on stage, and thank you all for coming. We're here to talk a little bit about this book, which is a book that I published last year with my co-author, Morgan Mills. Unfortunately, Morgan could not join us this evening. She's still in Happy Valley Goose Bay. But I'm very grateful to be here for the Nickel to invite us, to Latonia for all of the supports for being here, to be able to have a little chat about this book and to be able to have a chat about this book with three people who I think are central in the creation of this book. I'm not blowing smoke. I do want to be specific. I do think that all books do come from communities, and it's just that in this instance, we're very fortunate to have members of the community that this book documents to be able to talk about the book, and I can't think of a better way to actually talk about it. So thank you all for being here. So what I want to do is I've got some general questions that I want to ask them. Together, the goal here is to actually try to interrogate the idea of a Labrador cinema, to see if it holds water, to see if it's actually something that's even useful. And I think that the best way to come at this idea is by talking again to people who've been involved in it. So I'm going to introduce all of our panelists. I've got some general questions for them, and I'm certainly happy to open it up afterwards, but I'm going to be selfish and hog the mic for the first little bit and pose some questions. So joining me today, we have Anne Budgell, as a journalist who spent 34 years working for CBC in Newfoundland and Labrador in a variety of jobs. She and Nigel Markham co-directed the NFB documentary, The Last Days of Ocock, which was released in 1985. Anne is the author of two nonfiction books, Dear Everybody, A Woman's Journey from Park Avenue in a Labrador to a Labrador Trapline, published by Boulder Books in 2013, and We All Expected to Die, Spanish Influenza in Labrador, 1918-1919, published by Memorial University Press in 2018. Anne's family is from Labrador. We also have Latonia Hartery, a filmmaker and archaeologist from Bay d'Espoir. She's been working in the film industry for 13 years and under the banner of her company, LJH Film, and she's currently a producer on the NFB's multi-year initiative, the Labrador Doc Project. Latonia also has a PhD in the Indigenous archaeology of Newfoundland, Labrador, and the Arctic. We also have Jennie Williams, an award-winning Inuk photographer, filmmaker, and performer from Happy Valley Goose Bay, Labrador. Jennie's extensive photographic work on the Naliuk tradition led her to direct a short film as part of the Labrador Doc Project called Naliuk Night, which has won several awards, including the 2022 Canadian Screen Award for Best Documentary Short. Jennie also performs nationally and internationally as an Inuk drum dancer and throat singer. She loves to teach workshops to all ages about Inuit culture, Inuit performing arts, and filmmaking. So thank you again, all three of you.
Thank you for having us.
Now, I wanted to start with your bios. I think this is actually the best way in, just to give people sort of a general context, but I do believe that it's more important that each of you tell your own stories. I just want everyone to sort of know who's on the stage. And that's my first question to all of you is, I'm hoping, and maybe we can start with you, Anne, just tell me a little bit about your experience with making media in Labrador.
Well, I want to first say that Nigel Markham was supposed to be here tonight, not me. And I wish he was here, because Nigel is like the senior statesman of Labrador documentary topics. He's done so many things. He worked on your film, didn't he? He was the cinematographer. He's worked on so many films. But I want to mention some titles. Hunters and Bombers. Pelts, The Politics of the Fur Trade. Utishimatsits, The Place of the Boss, about Davis Inlet. In Caribou Country, Eye of the Storm, Till We Meet Again. He's either been the cinematographer and the director, or the cinematographer. Sometimes he's done everything. Sometimes he's worked with other people who were the producers or the directors, but he's done so many things. And a lot of those films have won many, many awards. Lots of them were done with the National Film Board. So I wish Nigel could have been here tonight. He asked me to fill in for him, so I thought, really, I have to mention Nigel, okay? And he and I worked long time ago on that film, The Last Days of Ocock, which has been seen hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times. It's been out there for so long. And I had been working at CBC as a reporter, and Nigel was working at CBC as a cameraman when we first met. And when I was a reporter at CBC, we were shooting film, black and white film. It had to be processed downstairs in the CBC building and then cut with a razor blade and taped together. I mean, this is how we were doing our news stories. And then we got a color lab, so we were shooting color film, and then it was video. Oh my God, video was so wonderful. I mean, the editing was so much quicker by comparison. But you know, whenever I talk about this, or whenever I say this to anybody, I always say that shooting film back then, when I'd be going out the newsroom, and one of the guys on the assignment desk would say, 1 magazine, 10 minutes of film. That's all you need for that story. Because it was expensive, and they didn't want all this time taken up in the lab with minutes and minutes of film going through being processed. And so you had to think, okay, I've got to get the question answered that I need to ask this person, and I need to get the shots that I need, and get this thing done, and get it in the lab, and get it out, and get it edited, and get it on the air by 6 o'clock tonight. I learned a lot of things about being efficient, which were good skills to have, even with video. But I used to see people who had never worked in film and were working in video, sitting down and doing these long interviews, taking all day, you know, and then they'd come back and they'd have tapes stacked up like this. When are you going to go through all of that, right? So I thought, I'm glad I learned on film, because it really taught me to be super efficient in the work that I was doing. But back then, I was the junior person in the newsroom, and they had no concerns or interests in Labrador, really. And I think I was working with Here and Now. I worked as a news reporter for a while, and then I worked with Here and Now, and I suggested that we should go to Labrador and do some stories in Labrador. And we went to the North Coast, and there was a producer with me, Dave Kando, a sound recordist, Bill Murphy, and Doug Pike, the film cameraman, and loads of film. We were shooting film. And we were in Hopedale, Makovic, Postville, and Nain, and I've been thinking about it, trying to remember what stories did we do. We tried to do a lot of stories that would stand up and we could play out over weeks to come. One thing we did, because we had a chartered aircraft, we had our own plane, we flew over all the little places that we were visiting, got aerial shots, and then I would just do a little voiceover saying, this is Postville, how many people live here, what they do for a living, this is what it looks like. Because I knew most people who were our audience in Newfoundland had never been to Labrador, may never ever go to Labrador. And I really wanted to show people what Labrador looked like and who lived there. Anyway, I've talked for long enough, but that's my early experience as a person who was working in film.
But I find this really interesting, because I think that your experience of leaving Labrador to go back to shoot in Labrador is probably not uncommon for most people that end up making film in Labrador, that there's always that process of having to go somewhere to do the work. So maybe this is a good time for Jennie to take on that question, but your experience with making media in Labrador.
So I started out as a photographer almost 20 years ago. And then, so I did photography up there, and I had exhibits in different places across Canada. And then I knew that I always wanted to make a film, but before I moved from Nain, because I lived in Nain for 12 years. And I knew that I was going to move to Newfoundland, which was 4 years ago. I moved here. And I just had to do that film somehow. And then the Labrador Doc Project advertisement came up. And because I wasn't sure how to go about making the film, I was like, this is, couldn't figure it out. It was so much unknown. But when that came out, I sent in a proposal. I wanted to do a film on Naliuk Night because in my exhibits of photography, which I did in black and white, people always had a lot of questions because they'd see this like really scary character and they'd be like, what is this all about? And where they haven't heard about it before, even though it's in Labrador, a tradition. A lot of people had no idea what the heck it was and they were looking at. And I was in these exhibits and openings and stuff and trying to explain in like 2 or 3 minutes to someone when they're asking what Naliuk Night is and what a Naliuk is, and it was just not enough time. So I said, okay, well, this 13-minute film will be just enough. And I won't have to like try to squeeze it into 2 minutes when I'm talking to someone. They can just look at the film and they'll know all about it. So that's why I made my first film, because I realized in photography I didn't have enough time to get all that information into somebody who was wondering.
So
Yeah.
you were already thinking then about just the importance of time-based media while doing the photographic work. Did you have opportunities to train at all, like before working on the Labrador Doc Project? Like, did you do any kind of work in film before that?
No, that was my first
That was your first.
experience. But because I was already taking photos in the on Naliuk Night in the freezing cold and like -40 or -50 every year, I learned skills on how to use a camera in the freezing cold in Labrador. If I didn't do all those years, my film wouldn't have turned out like it did, because all that experience of taking photos on that freezing cold in the night with no lights and only street lights and skidoo lights made me, just the personal experience made me be able to do that film. Like, I didn't go to university or anything. I just went out and took photos and got experience that way.
Fantastic. So I think now, when I ask you this question, maybe the way in is actually to talk a little bit about the Labrador Doc Project, because I'm sure that some people here know what it is, but it is obviously a structuring and very important project in contemporary Labrador filmmaking. So maybe that's the way in.
Yeah, so that's basically, well, I've been kicking around now for a while with 20 years doing research and film and things in general, but the Labrador Doc Project certainly is the biggest project that I've worked on in Labrador. So essentially what that is a multi-year project. Basically from 2018 to 2023, 4 documentaries were the result of that half a decade, basically. And those 4 documentaries, the purpose of them was to basically foster and create Indigenous stories by Indigenous storytellers, and to disseminate those films in Newfoundland and Labrador, sure, but also throughout the world, so that that Inuit point of view could be really spread across the globe, if you will, and people provide people with a portal into what life and culture in Labrador is like. And not only training directors and writers and producers, but also Inuit animators, production assistants, production managers, costumes, food, like just imbuing these documentaries with Inuit input on every single level that you could possibly imagine. And then on top of that, in addition to creating that capacity to build that network, which definitely Labrador needs on that larger, more commercial structure, is to fold in as many communities as we could. So we filmed in, see if I can get them all. So Happy Valley Goose Bay, Northwest River, Rigolette, Makovic, Hopedale, Maine, and some footage from Hebron as well. So that in some ways, it's like the coastline, contiguously unfolding, that there's just this pattern of communities that were also represented. And to get the films out there in multiple languages as well, because they are available in English, French, and Inuktitut as well. And that's kind of like basically the crux of it, but also just to make sure to find a path through, to sort of create it, but also fold in the tradition of Labrador filmmaking that was already there, and ensuring that if any Inuk was in the documentary, that they would see themselves and they would see the film before anybody else would, and be able to give feedback, and always have a community showing as well before the films would be put out there into the world, so that things could come back if there's changes or anything that we need to make, which is a little bit different, right, than sometimes the colonial history of making a documentary, where you go in, extract the story, and then sometimes people in that film see it when everybody else in the world sees it. So try to recenter the Indigenous narrative a little bit more. That was a long project. I really put my whole heart, everything I had into it, and so did so many people that we work with. Glenn Gear is back there as well, who's one of our collaborators. And for as much as I put into it, certainly I learned a whole lot that I hope will inform some of the things I say this evening.
So I'm curious then, how aware were all of you, and we can go back around, maybe we'll actually start with you, Latonia, and then come back the other way, because you did talk about the idea of trying to find and look at films from the region. How aware were you of a Labrador filmmaking tradition, when you started your work, and how did you find the content? How did you source it?
Well, I think I was just generally aware, because I have been working in arts and culture and tourism and in Newfoundland and Labrador and the Arctic for quite some time now. It's almost 2 decades. So I just think over the course of time, and also rooting around and digging around, I knew of certainly certain traditional cinemas, right? You would know if you were involved in Labrador filmmaking at all or knew anything about it, you would obviously know about the OK Society and the massive output that the OK Society would have had in the last 30 or 40, 1985, right? They were
83.
83.
Yeah.
Right. And the diversity in the programming that they had, especially Anne had mentioned Nigel Markham, who had made several films with the OK Society as well. So I was aware of all of that. But also I think hyper aware, because I do specialize in a lot of Arctic stuff, just the genesis of filmmaking in Newfoundland and Labrador, how it began with people in some ways not from here, right? Because I'm interested in the Arctic, then there's no way you can get around not knowing about early exploration and early expedition footage. And that's what does constitute a lot of the initial footage of Newfoundland and Labrador. It's both parts of our province are conduits, that race to the North Pole, where expeditioners were rock stars and everything way back then. So a lot of the Bartlett stuff, Perry's kind of journey to the pole, Richard Finney, Northwest Passage Patrol. So just by, I think, the very nature of that being my career, I came by a lot of it, honestly. But certainly, just a plug for the book here, since we're talking about it, there were giant swaths of knowledge that I didn't have, which I'm so profoundly grateful that you've synthesized all of this. When you think about wartime films in Labrador, industrial films, that's the kind of thing that I think wasn't necessarily on my radar before I read that book. Yeah.
Thanks for the plug. I'll turn that to you, Jenny, because from my knowledge, I don't think that Naliuks had ever been filmed before your film. I can't think of anything that I've ever seen. So, were you working in a tradition? Were you aware of any kind of filmmaking tradition in the region? Or for you, was this sort of just newly constituted? Was this something that you created with your own vision?
Yeah, I knew that there was never a film created about Naliuk Night. And I knew there wasn't very much information either. If I wanted to give someone a link to go learn more, or something, stories, there was hardly anything. So that's why I wanted to do that one, and I decided as a filmmaker at that time that I want to create films that about things that nobody has ever made a film on before. So, and to be about Labrador and Labrador Inuit, and there's just so much there to capture that has not been captured, and to have somebody like me who's from there and like grew up in Labrador and understands Inuit culture, and I think it's really cool to have to be able to go there now that I have all those skills from doing that first film. I learned so much through that process. Like, it took 4 years for us to create the film that I made, and I knew about the films that Anne was talking about. I had watched those before, and I love the old footage and like the stuff captured. So I don't know, in the way that it looks in black and white. That's why I made my film in black and white, even though it's now, like, it's in the future and most films are made in color. I made mine in black and white, and I just love how you talked about like how you had to do it back then, how much work it was, and I just I think about that sometimes and just appreciate it a lot, and it gives a different feeling, I find, just looking at it that way. More of like thinking back to older times or something. So I knew about some films, and I knew that there wasn't a lot of people my age or younger doing something like that, like creating films, and that's why I really wanted to do it, and I'm so glad that I did. Now I'm going to be teaching other young people. Like, I'm going to go back to Labrador and teach other young people what I did and how I did it, because I had no clue how to do it, and now I do know. So now I want to go back and go into schools, like junior highs and high schools and stuff like that, and teach them like how to apply for grants, or like how I did it. What do they do? That's what I want to do.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, this is like, I feel like maybe you should just jump in, but I mean, just to sort of like make a plug for what you're doing. I mean, there's so few opportunities to learn about filmmaking in Labrador, full stop, that like, unless it's people coming back to the region, right, and like actively transferring skills, like I don't know how it happens.
I'm going to answer your earlier question about the tradition. I've been thinking about that. When Nigel and I first met, he came to work in St. John's with CBC. I was already here working with CBC. I had worked in Labrador for a year with radio, not with television, with CBC. And we got to know each other. He had been working, before he worked with CBC, he worked with the Labrador Inuit Association, the predecessor of Nunatsiavut government. And one of the jobs they gave him was to travel all over the coast and ask people, what photographs have you got in your house? What old photographs do you have? And he copied everything. And he made 2 copies of everything, thank goodness, because there was a fire that destroyed one half of that collection, but the whole collection still exists because he made 2 copies of everything. So this was the start of Them Days magazine too, right? He was involved with Doris Saunders in the start of Them Days magazine. He taught Doris how to shoot film, how to shoot camera. He taught Doris how to process and make her own picture prints, you know. So Nigel he's such an important person when it comes to anything visual to do with Labrador in those days. He taught a lot of people a lot of stuff very generously, and doesn't get the attention and the praise that he deserves. Anyway, he said to me, you know what, we should apply for a grant to make a film about the Spanish flu in Labrador. He knew about it. He'd heard the stories. I didn't know much about it. I've now written a book about it. He knew about it. He told me about it. And he said, we should do this soon, because the only people left alive to tell the story are very old people now. And if we don't get this going now and go up there now and get their story, they're going to be gone. There will be nobody to tell this story. And we got 2 grants. We got one from the Canada Council, one from the Newfoundland Labrador Arts Council. And by the way, We never could afford to pay ourselves 5 cents for any of the work that we did on that. All the money went for airfares. This is the thing about working in Labrador. Airfares, accommodations, film stock. We were shooting film. We had to buy a lot of film stock. And we had to pay a sound recordist to come with us. We had to pay him a proper rate. We never got a cent until we sold the rough cut to the National Film Board. They were not our partners at the beginning, but they were our partners later, and then we got paid. But you were going to ask about how is it different, you know, doing work in Labrador. You better have a lot of money. Am I right? Yes.
Well, the fascinating thing is that it hasn't changed in
No.
this regard. I mean,
No.
and maybe we should give a copy of this recording to Philip Earle afterwards at Air Borealis. But it really is, so much of a production budget is travel expenses, right? And logistics. And I mean, so much energy is just sort of spent around logistics. You almost see how, like, I find your comments really interesting about the earlier kind of extractive tradition of documentary filmmaking, that you could almost understand why people would incline towards doing that. They would go to the region, they would film it, and they would probably have a crazy bill at the end of that and go, oh my gosh, I've got to recoup some of these losses, so I'm going to go and stream this stuff wherever I can. And certainly, like in the first 20, 30 years of film, I mean, people did just that. They did these elaborate, like, illustrated like lecture circuits, right? I mean, some of the earliest footage from Labrador, like they got integrated into that kind of stuff. But I do find it interesting that it is like, there was that pivot with documentary around like the 1970s where it became a more like local concern, and now is like, to my mind, a regional sort of like specialty, right? That you see that transition with the people like Nigel working with organizations like OK, and now like, you know, coming to Jennie, which is like taking the form and like doing something else with it, which I think is absolutely fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So are there certain, I mean, like logistics aside, are there other aspects to the tradition of Labrador cinema that you think that are common, like aside from content? I mean, like I'm a believer that sort of like anything that's kind of shot in Labrador, like right now anyway, can reasonably be admitted to a tradition of Labrador cinema. But are there other things that are specific to that?
I want to say something about the long list, well, the list that Latonia mentioned of all the explorer type people, like the Varick Frizzels and those people. They weren't all filmmakers, but there were people who explored and then wrote about it, or, you know, before there was film possible, you know, they did illustrations. But it was always, and you refer to this in your book, it was always this formidable, horrible place that nobody ever should go to. It was so cold and dangerous. And you know, Frizzell, when he went up to the Grand River, now called the Churchill River, just to see the falls and to film the falls, Churchill Falls, now formerly the Grand Falls, he didn't refer, when he wrote about this, to all the Labrador people who were there with him, who helped him get there. He made it sound like he and another guy, or maybe 2 or 3 of them, went up on their own with no help from anybody from Labrador. Now, you know, they build themselves up, right? They build themselves up. They're the explorers, they're the intrepid, they can go anywhere. They're out on the ice floes or wherever but they've always got some Labrador people paddling the boats and carrying the gear and doing all this stuff. That stuff really used to piss me off. Still does, I guess.
So this probably is something that's hard baked into the tradition, is unrecognized labor.
Yeah.
Like really, I think that's.
And this over-romanticizing of the place. And, you know, there are a lot of rough places in the world. In Canada, I mean, there are many, many rough places all across Canada. But Labrador was the last place that hadn't been yet fully explored, I guess, easily. I mean, you could get up there in a boat. You could get in New York City, get a boat, and the next thing you know, you're in Rigolette and you're hiring people to go wherever you're going, or, you know, you're in Nain or Hopedale. You can get there easily compared to, say, the Yukon or whatever, right? So we were a target for all these people who wanted to make their name as explorers.
I'm curious how you feel about that, Latonia, somebody from outside the region, like being aware of that tradition and like how that shaped your work then.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree with everything that Anne is saying, and I think really we can't gloss over the logistics too of making things, you know, in the sense that I think when you look at Newfoundland and Labrador too generally, it's the difficulties that are there with forming any kind of certainly theatrical cinema, but even just media in general, there are conditions around it that sometimes make it difficult. And in that way, it's no surprise then that a lot of the Labrador tradition has been very documentary based, where because documentaries don't need massive amounts of crews, you know, you could theoretically, if you want, even in a news report or a smaller documentary, it'd just be 2 or 3 people. But if you were making a television show or a short film, as you know, you're looking at, if it's a narrative, you might need 30 people, or TV show, some days you've got 200 people working. And the infrastructure in Labrador at this moment, because of it's so logistically complex and expensive, it doesn't support that. So because of that ruralness, the same thing as places outside the Avalon in Newfoundland, right? It is defined in some ways by those traditions. And it's a good point, like when we went to Nain to film, I mean, just getting ourselves there, and we brought everything we brought almost 2 of, because if it broke down, there was no way to replace it. So twice the normal amount of gear, getting ready to shoot in -40, excess baggage out the wazoo. So by the time you even just get yourself there, you know what I mean, it's $10,000, $15,000, and you haven't even shot anything yet. But luckily, when you do get there, there's a lot of support from the community, I must say. And for us, we did hire a lot of, you know what I mean? Like, local people are the collaborators. Without them, there is no film. There's everybody kind of working together. So I think that is really important. And I think because of that, no matter if people have made films from inside, community films, or, you know, smaller community films or larger community films, or the 500 Labrador Mute episodes by the OK Society, like, that's all very magazine style, like direct documentary approach. And I think a lot of the reason relates to this, you know, it's not so much a lack, but it's just the way that the environment or the land exists. Whereas here, of course, in St. John's on the Avalon, we're close to a production center. We're close to the place that all the money rolls through. In 2021 and 2022, the Newfoundland and Labrador economic activity was $85 million for the film industry. How much of that do you think went to Labrador? 0? Probably. I don't know if it's exactly 0, but if you had to put out a % of that, it would be quite low.
They got a film crew up to the Torngats to get some tourism pictures, maybe.
Yeah.
That might have been 5 million there.
Yeah. So, you know, that would be, I mean, I know it's one of your end questions, but certainly that would be a dream, is to have Labrador be part of that narrative cinema tradition. I don't know a lot about animation, unfortunately, but I know Glenn is here and can probably talk a bit about that at some point. But yeah, but we know in terms of a narrative cinema, like feature films and stuff, they just, at this point, they're not existing in Labrador, but there are ways around that.
Absolutely. I find it really, it's fascinating to see too how, at least the way I see it, and I'll turn this question to you in 1 second, but how local tastes kind of adjust to sort of available means. So I'm very fortunate to call Ohala Hatagit Society my employer, and we talk a lot about Labrador Inuit, and this show ended in 2011, and we still talk a lot about this show. And the thing that they consistently hear from their viewers there is that they want it back. And they want it back in a way, like in a perhaps a more unencumbered way, like the way that it was sort of like in early years, where they're kind of free to be able to do elder shows, or what they used to call them day shows within the context, not referring to the magazine, but just like earlier day shows. Do Christmas specials. That like there's a real taste for that kind of documentary tradition, certainly amongst that viewership. But I'm curious, Jennie, like for you, like, did you feel a real need to stake like a community claim in making this film? I mean, from the region, like I'm sure you had a sense of all of these interlopers that would come in and position themselves as look at me, this sole documentarian who's so amazing, and like I've done all this stuff. Like, did you feel like you really had to work against that tradition, and like, did that define kind of what you did?
No, not really.
Good, yeah. No, but to me, then that's probably evidence of genuine community-based filmmaking
Yeah.
rather than.
Like, I knew that not very many people was doing it, but that's what I wanted to begin, I guess. Like, I wanted to. I know about the Labrador moot, and you know how that's so awesome, and that sort of trying to get not that going again, but some kind of film stuff going in Labrador again was really exciting for me, and I wanted to add something to the thing that you said. I was speaking to, when was that film done about the falls? Was it coming up to be 100 years?
It's over 100 years now, I think.
Is it 100? Is it almost 100 years soon or something?
It's early 20s, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention something to you about that one, because I've been talking to Heidi in Goose Bay, because she filmed an interview on me when I went up to teach about throat singing a couple months ago in Goose Bay. And we've been talking about a project that we want to do together. So we want to, what you said about those people that went there, the explorers or whatever, and they didn't give credit to people that should have got credit. So we want to sort of recreate that film in a way that we're capturing young people and the ones that are rowing the boats and the ones that are doing all the work, getting food and doing all the stuff that was done then. And she was even looking into some family members that may have been related to some of the ones that actually rowed the boats and actually did all that stuff.
There are those people, for
Yes.
sure.
So what we're going to do is we're going to get, well, we've just been talking about this lately, that we want to do this. So we want to get a group of young people and then have like me on there teaching them how to direct. Like they're gonna do this film. We're just gonna give them the skills. So create new filmmakers by, I think Ozzy Mitchell might be interested in coming, and he would help with whatever skills he has, and whatever skills I learned doing a film, I will be teaching one or two of the young people, and the film will be about the stuff that those people did to create the film.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. So like the grunt work and like the learning about the film too, both of those things kind of together?
Yeah. So I wanted, because I heard you say that, I wanted to tell you that we're planning on doing
Yeah,
that. Yeah, so, and then in that way, we're showing the process of how that film was created so long ago, but the right process, the cool stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
the real work. Yeah, not just
Yeah.
the flashy shots. And
Yes,
yeah.
by someone that's not from there or whatever,
Yeah.
you know.
I have research material I will share with you.
Okay.
Likewise, I will give you a couple of more films if you want to use them for research as part of that too.
Yes,
That's
that'd
fantastic.
be awesome. Yeah, we just been start talking about that last couple months actually, to do that.
Grand. So this leads, I think, logically then to this question is, like, do you find, like, is it useful to even talk about Labrador cinema? And I genuinely asked that question. Like, you know, Morgan and I were sort of writing this book, like, ourselves. I mean, this came out of, we had a film screening series in Goose Bay that we ran for about 6-7 years called Labradorians on Film. So we were able to get sort of like community feedback, and there was an appetite to see this as a book. But I don't know that we necessarily like tested the concept per se, sort of with the audience.
You've created it now, haven't you?
Well, maybe, but
It's out there now.
But it's out there now. But like, does it get in the way though? This is what I'm wondering. Like, I feel like it's important to lobby for the region.
I think you're right. I read your question. He sent us the questions in advance so we could think about this. And I thought, I wonder, what should I say about that? Well, I think that I'm glad you're validating it And I'm glad you're pointing out that it's there and that it exists and what's been done. Because your book has a lot of things in it that many people don't know, including me. I mean, I'm an old person now, and I've been around for a while, and I love reading stuff about this. There was a lot of stuff in that book I didn't know about. And there's probably more yet to be discovered. I've told Mark, I said, all the film stuff that we shot for years at CBC, a lot of that stuff was trashed. They would run out of room in the library, and where are they going to put it? I mean, it's a can of film, and people were always pirating it and taking shots out of it. If they needed a shot of the wharf at Black Tickle, they'd go to that story someone did and haul out that shot. The story's ruined. They'd put some blank in there, and not even the right length. So then the audio and the video didn't match up anymore and stuff like that. Anyway, there was stuff shot that's gone. I worked on the program On Camera. Maybe some people remember that show. It used to be half an hour a week. And we would do documentaries and studio shows because we didn't have enough money to do all documentaries. And one of the shows I did, we went to Labrador, and we had a helicopter chartered that time, and we followed Judge Jim Iglo-Liorte as he held court in Rigolet, and then he held court in Hopedale, and we went here, we went there with him, just about how a judge did court in Labrador. I had a video, a VHS of it, which I gave to the University Archive, so I know there's that copy. But CBC trashed a lot of stuff. There was no value placed on it. And not only the Labrador material. I mean, that was true of all the film that they shot. What was I talking about? I'm sorry. I went way off the rails.
No, just whether or not the idea of even talking about a Labrador cinema is even sort of.
Yeah, I'm glad you've actually validated it. And now we can say there is Labrador cinema.
Thank you. What about you, Latonia? I mean, I feel like just even from an economic activity standpoint, just some of your comments about what the total number of investment dollars was in film, maybe the idea is useful in that context.
I would agree. I mean, certainly it's a conversation for the people of Labrador. But I would agree. I think that it's useful. And I think that as a concept, it doesn't mean if there's a broader concept that the individual capacity for filmmaking is lost, right? I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. So if there is a Labrador cinema, it doesn't mean that there's not an Inuit cinema in Labrador or an Innu cinema or a settler cinema. In a way, those things will be the tapestry that forms Labrador cinema. And I think the way that you've proposed it is that cinema is not just something that's theatrical. It's the small bits of filmmaking, it's the CBC, the NFB, it's the whole gamut of everything. I think probably even stronger still is the Labrador and Newfoundland cinema or film industry, because the film industry works in a way where it's product and investment feedback loop. So the more productions there are, the more the investments there are, and then it grows every single year. So if you're pooling Labrador projects, whether they're big cinema projects or whether they're smaller projects, and then everything in Newfoundland as well, then the groundswell of the voices just creates a larger body of people speaking to an issue and to building things where things need to be built. And the proof in this pudding, really, is if you look at Arctic cinema today, especially the Sami in Scandinavia, they've created a groundswell basically because of what they've done. All the people in the circumpolar ring basically have identified with being in the circumpolar ring and have in the last decade or so really moved towards looking at cinema in the north as part of this circumpolar ring. So now there's Sami feature films that are world renowned, that are playing everywhere in the Explorers Club, all over the place. Netflix has a new television series that's going to be shot in Iqaluit. So if that's the case, there's no reason that Netflix couldn't be having a show in Nain. So if you build it as a big network of voices rising up and saying, hey, we're here, we have a tradition, then things will happen. So I think in that way, just saying, hey, there's a Labrador cinema. You might not all know about it, but it exists, and here's the voice. And a lot of this voice, especially in your book there, is given a lot of credit to Indigenous filmmaking in Labrador, which, you know, you'll see everywhere. It's like, oh, there's not that much Indigenous film work in Labrador, but there is a ton. Whether it's theatrical or not, that's a different story, but that media making exists. So I guess that's a long way around. I feel passionate about the answer.
No, I appreciate it. Because there are so few opportunities to celebrate, in particular, I mean, as I'm sure you know, Jenny, like Indigenous filmmakers from Labrador, like as Indigenous filmmakers from Labrador. I mean, like Christine Poker, who I'm sure some folks know here, like just, like it's amazing her output. She's, and again, somebody who's worked and trained with Nigel, it's unbelievable what she's been able to accomplish working at Netwashish, where like there's relatively modest, well, I mean non-existent production resources, right? And it always surprises me, sort of like kind of how lost like some of those titles get just once they start to leave the region. It's like, oh yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. And even like compiling sort of a definitive list of kind of Christine's films, it was a little bit difficult. I think that there's some missing from this too.
Yeah. What do you think about the Labrador concept, like a Labrador cinema?
I think the book's friggin' deadly. Thanks. That's a good start. And I think it is a little bit of a start, because I know there's a lot of stuff done before, but I feel like this Labrador doc project has started something. And I feel like it's like a new chapter's starting or something. I don't know how to explain it, but all that stuff is gathered in your book, and then that's going to be helpful for us too when we're going to teach other people, or people like us who want more filmmakers.
And when you're
that's
looking
good.
for grants.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
good,
a
yeah. I
great-
mean, that's
it's a
the
good
hope, is that
resource.
this is a blunt object, right? That you can sort of
Yeah. I'm
you
so
can
glad
use.
it is there. It's good. Yeah.
Fantastic. What now would you all like to see develop next within a regional cinematic tradition in Labrador?
I'm really happy to hear Jenny talk about planning to bring your skills to other people and get other people interested. And I'm happy that the Nickel is involved in that and doing a lot of that work too. So more of that, because I don't think you have to twist any kid's arm to get them to come into a classroom and learn how to do this kind of thing. You know, they're going to love that. But you know, when I wanted to add something more on that question though. Some of the people here in the room may remember the Challenge for Change project of the National Film Board and Memorial University's Extension Department years and years ago. Went to Fogo Island. It was when the fishery was failing there. And Fogo Island, I mean, is a large island with a lot of separate communities. Some of them were communities of Protestant people, some of them Catholic, and they didn't even talk to each other for a long time. Well, the filmmakers decided, well, what can we do? The Challenge for Change here, they went into communities, got people talking about what are we going to do to keep this island alive, and then they would take that film and show it in the community where there were other people who had the same problems and same difficulties, but hadn't spoken to their near neighbors about these things. They were showing things back and forth. And it actually helped them come to some conclusions about what to do, you know, form a co-op and work together. That all that work ended. I mean, Memorial got rid of the extension department. There's no sort of social activism going on now with filmmaking. And I don't think Facebook takes its place. I don't think social media takes the place, because it's not like this, like a room full of people where we're talking, we're actually face to face with our faces. And there are opportunity here for exchange, and it's not impersonal. I mean, if somebody wants to speak here, they can speak. There's no anonymous troll going to pop up and say something horrible, right? So I think I'd like to see something with an edge of social activism, or what can we do, you know, to help our communities? Yeah.
So maybe this is a good time for Jenny to respond to that.
Was there a question?
Yeah. What's next in the
Wasn't
tradition?
paying attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's next in the tradition? Do you want to do you want to build on sort of what Anne is envisioning, a sort of more social activism in a
Yes.
filmmaking tradition, a media making tradition in Labrador? But anything else?
Yes, I do definitely want to do that. And I've been teaching different workshops for different things for so many years that I think that I can, with my skills now, I think that I can go there and like teach full-on filmmaking workshops with these young people. I even have now become like a film editor myself. I think I could even teach that at this point, like teach them how to be directors, how to be videographers, photographers. Like, that's a big thing that I want to do. I want to go there and teach young people so that maybe out of some of those people, I'll have some people that are passionate about it like me, and then they can keep it going, you know. Even if someone that lives there I can find to be like that. I don't know anyone that I can think of in Goose Bay or anywhere that is like that right now. I don't know. Ozzy's there sometimes, but we're both from there, but we don't live there. Heather. Yeah. So there is some people, but it's just starting. Like, I feel like it's just beginning.
So my follow-up question for you specifically then is, what do you think that sustainable film training looks like in Labrador? Is it still like in a workshop basis? I mean, is there something else that could be done? Is it like, I don't know, like if Memorial offered something as part of the Labrador campus, is it something that the college should do? Is there another way to support this?
That would be amazing. And if they want to figure out, like, they could probably ask the people that did the Labrador Dock project what a good workshop would look like, how to get the young people involved. We'd be good ones to ask, I think, to create something like that, the four of us that have done it and worked we worked on the film for 4 years, and I was there through the whole process. So I think if they got us in a room together, we could create like a super cool thing that they could create classes or something with. And they definitely should, because like people are getting older, traditions are changing, everything is changing. Like, if there's a time to do it, it's now. So I think I want to push for something like that to happen. That'd be awesome.
This is, I mean, like, through the process of writing the book, this is one thing that becomes pretty obvious, is that there's often sort of like fits and stops of like when people put investment into these things. And sometimes, like in the case of Extension, there's a lot of investment put in, but all it takes is one little thing to like bring down that house of cards, and then the whole thing goes away. All of the investment in training, all the equipment, all of that sort of like local knowledge, it just kind of evaporates. What about you, Latonia? What do you think about like future directions for?
Well, I think certainly acknowledging already what is there, what you've done with your book, that's an important part. And true, there's more tradition of developing Indigenous talent, but Indigenous talent still does exist, you know what I mean? Like Amanda Gear is here from Labrador, she's working with the CBC right now. Zach Bunnell is an Inuk cameraman. Glenn is in the audience as an animator and, you know, multi-talented person. So there are people around who can do the work, and if it is an Indigenous project, the dream would be that those people would be hired to do that work. You know, sometimes I hear people say that in the industry, oh, well, there's not a lot of Indigenous filmmakers around. I was like, no, that's not true. It's that you don't know them. That does not equate to them not being around. So that's an important first step, just acknowledging that there are people that can tell their own stories. That's a critical part. If I was running the province, which I don't, not yet anyway, I would definitely create a satellite of like a network of financiers and stuff in Labrador. So the Newfoundland and Labrador Film Development Corporation, they have a person in Labrador. Arts NL has a person in Labrador. The Department of Finance has a person in Labrador. So it's a little tiny filmmaking hub where people can call when they have all those kinds of questions, and so that if a Labradorian is calling, they're calling to somebody who has a common bond with them and knows the culture or the place that they're from, as opposing to calling strangers in St. John's, you know what I mean? Like, there's something to be said for having a common background in terms of accessing information in a way that feels welcoming and all that stuff that I would say Labradorians know. The other thing I would do is, right now, the funding production models, it's like when a financier like Telefilm or somebody gives you funds, it's not necessarily for capital funds. So they don't love it if you go out and buy a $50,000 camera, but you can rent $50,000 worth of cameras, but you can't buy one. That's like a no-no. But I think considering where, in both parts of the province, especially in the rural places, and especially in Labrador, which doesn't have this narrative cinema that we do on a big scale like we do here in St. John's. I think actually for the next 10 years, government funds should be devised specifically for that purpose. Because if you want a good camera to make your films, an editing suite, a color suite, all that stuff, it's literally anywhere between $10,000 and $100,000, and smaller communities just don't have that kind of money to create it. So that when Jennie and Ozzy and Holly and Heather come to a community, they're there for a month, they're doing training. Well, what's the good if then they leave and there's no infrastructure behind for people to practice on? Like, that needs to exist. And even though it's not typical for the industry to work that way, if we're gonna, again, decolonize it and recenter it and think of it differently, then why not at least for that base route to be set up? And then you'll find that it'll, again, be that loop that feeds itself. Oh, there's a production now. There's a
Maybe NIFCO should start a branch. It should be the LIFCO.
LIFCO.
Well, I mean, there would be nothing here
I
if
laugh 'cause it's
NIFCO
true.
hadn't done
Yeah.
what it did. You know,
Yes,
the
we could
co-op
have a
one.
LIFCO.
And, but
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like that in Labrador, of a
Yeah.
co-op or a rental bank for the
Yeah.
equipment to be in, that people could get it and rent it or whatever.
Yeah, and maybe even 2 different hubs. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly the OK Society, you know, it is kind of already a hub in Nain, and to, you know what I mean, even foster that and grow it. And that way, maybe if Happy Valley Goose Bay was one place and Nain, something in Nain was another, then if you're making films in the middle of Labrador, then, you know, you're coming from those hubs as opposed to schlepping everything from St. John's. And then if that infrastructure is there, then lo and behold, you know, you really will see a Labrador cinema then, I tell you, because it's like all the resources are there for the people who are born and grown up in the stories to tell them. And they're invariably better when they're done that way. Like, if you think about Nellie Knight and all the work on that, I mean, that was a portal into a world that most people had never, ever seen because it was done in such a specific way also. And that can be done over and over, you know, again. But there are realities that need to be filled, and the province is better, the world is better, you know, when that diversity of stories is told.
I think you and I need to have a conversation with Jamie Felsberg in the next couple of weeks, who's the new Labrador rep and Indigenous Outreach Officer for Arts and L.
Let's do it. Let's all do
so,
it.
yeah.
Everybody sign up.
Yeah.
Like, we'll be like, we'll just like send him a note, it's just Mark and I, and then he gets on the Zoom and it's like 30 people and it's everybody in this room. It's like, yeah.
I feel like I've probably asked enough. Are there questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Yeah, Pat.
You've all spoken quite a bit about the labor and the resources and the, I guess, grit that it takes to get films made in Labrador. I'd love to hear if you could talk a bit about what it takes to actually get films screened and shown. What does it take to show local films to local audiences?
Yeah, well, should I?
Oh, I recently did that, so I can tell you about that. So we wanted to show it earlier, but because of COVID, it got all freaked up and we couldn't go up. So anyway, we did go up, and we did did the screening was it this past year? Yes, this year, eh? Oh my God, I don't even know what year.
Yeah, it was.
This year.
Yeah, because you went up to took new pictures of Nellie.
Yes. I went up for Naluk Night this year, and that's when I have my screening. And it is difficult there because there's not like places to screen stuff. Like the main place had like toilet issues, so we couldn't use it. I mean, there's always something like it was froze up or something. I don't know. So, and that's like a little tiny spot. Like I would have had to do 2 screenings because there's only a little bit of chairs, right? But I did do 2 screenings in the community center. I did one in the afternoon for kids.
You got the film into festivals, right? I mean, those were big screenings, weren't they? Didn't you get
Yeah.
that film in a lot of festivals?
Yeah, I was in a lot of festivals, yeah, and all
And
over the world.
Was that part of your question too? How did they get out to the world, you mean, or just like the?
Well, both is very interesting. I'm just curious
Oh.
about the value of showing locally made films to local audiences.
Yes, of course. That's the most important part, really.
Yeah, that was really awesome experience actually, to actually go there and be surrounded by the community members and the children, and a lot of them hadn't seen it in person, so it was their first time. The majority, we did send up some copies before, but being there myself, surrounded by the people, was so awesome. And I could see the little kids, because there's like all different ages and community members in that film, and just seeing them being like, oh, there's my mom, or there's my sister, or, you know, oh, cool, there's me, you know. And never even knew they were there. Like, it was just so many different, like, we shot the film on the night, like on the actual tradition. I mean, we had one night, we went up there with a small crew, like same thing like a long time ago. You go up with, like Latonia came up, we had 2 camera people, Nigel was one of them, and 1 sound guy. And we had one night. If we didn't get it that night, we would do it again next year.
There would be no movie.
Yeah, so,
No pressure. No pressure. No.
yeah, it was like minus 50 or something on the ice. Like,
Yeah, the cameras were freezing. The liquid, it was so cold. The liquid crystal display and like the LCD little screens, they were just freezing up. So we had to put hot pockets on the cameras and hot pockets with the batteries. And
I learned that from years of taking
Yeah,
photography with my DSLR. I would stick those heat things from your feet that you would put under your feet. I stick them in my pockets, and I would put my extra batteries in there, and in my mitts, because you'd have to take your mitts off and take pictures and put them back in right fast, because it would freeze your hands in like 30 seconds or something.
yeah,
And put them all over the camera itself. Like,
yeah.
it was very interesting. I
I'm
mean, yeah.
Just going to say, though, that to his question about getting things screened, I mean, all this work that everybody does, if the films aren't seen somewhere, or if you can't sell them or get them on television or get them streamed somewhere, I mean, you don't make a living doing it.
Yeah, and that was the point that you made in the book that we discussed a little bit before everything started here, is just like in some of the traditions, not only in the Labrador part, the Newfoundland part too, you have these, especially with some of the local productions, they're aired, and then often after that they are shelved. So it's almost like then they go out of memory because people aren't watching them anymore and they're not distributed, right? Which is to your question, the flip side of the Labrador Doc Project is that because it comes with the National Film Board of Canada, they are a distributor in and of themselves. They have specialists who are assigned to Naluk Night to get it into festivals, and that person has been applying to festivals on behalf of the NFB, for 20 years or something, so knows how to thoughtfully apply to the right venues and stuff like that. And that's all part of the Labrador Doc Project, really getting out into the world, is because the NFB is in itself a big distributor of that kind of thing. And
Yeah,
it'll be
that-
similar thing for Aussie's films in many festivals, and Holly's film Hebron Relocation, that's already had its world premiere at Hot Docs, which is a very difficult documentary film festival to get into. It's one of the biggest ones in Canada, but that's where she had her world premiere. So the NFB is really great in that regard. But if it's a smaller, more local production, or a super independent short film or something, or short doc, then you as an independent filmmaker become your own distributor then too. So it's harder that way.
Hard.
And that's if you're lucky. I mean, some of the historic film, it's unfortunate to see how sometimes rights can really shackle the distribution of, like, not even like particularly old film, but there's a film that was made late 60s, early 70s. And this was just before you started working in Labrador. I can't remember what the title of it is, but it was a co-production between the NFB and CBC. And the footage in there, like, it's the only footage I've ever seen of Kirkana Mako, who I'm not certain if anybody knows who Kirkana is, but she's a celebrated like women's rights advocate, and just like her life story is unbelievable in Labrador. But because they never worked out the rights for that, it's just there at Library and Archives
Moldering.
Canada. Exactly. No one can watch that. No one can like hear her talk, which seems wrong. Well, we'll have chat after. Was there another question?
I was going to ask a question, but kind of already answered that. I guess technology versus environment, the issue of, you talk about like getting access to film gear, but then of course having issues with like the super cold temperatures sometimes of the year. How do you see your way around that? Other than putting hot bags on.
Yeah, well.
Livco.
Lithco.
Yeah. Well, when we have when Livco's set up and that other production hub, that'll help that a little bit. I guess what I've learned from the Labrador Doc project and also the other years of filming really is just that extra level of preparedness. So here in St. John's, you might have a plan A and a plan B. But when we worked on the Labrador Dock project, we had a plan A, B, C, and D, because invariably things will go wrong that are beyond your control. And essentially you do, of all the key equipment, you kind of do need two of everything. I think for Jennie's, we had to throw ourselves into the -40, but for Holly's, we actually went in the fall for Hebron Relocation, the film we made, because it was less flies and that's the kind of look that she wanted. So just strategic planning, I guess, is the way around it. And if you're financing the film, also starting very, very early, because you do have to raise a lot more capital, I guess, or money that you might need to do if you're just making it in your town. So you need to start really early as well. And then just building on local experience. Before we went to any place, we always called the mayor, or like we just had so many people on the team from towns that calling ahead and just figuring out, what's going on, what do we need to take, like something like, I know it sounds trivial, but it's not when it's 33 cents for every extra pound, is like a first aid kit. So as a film crew, you always have to have a first aid kit. Something, people get electrocuted even on film sets. But we didn't bring things like that because the mayor and community halls would provide that kind of thing for us. So it's just the level of planning required, I find, is the way to go, really. It just has to be super thorough. Like, we were going to film Naliuk Night, and we just spent our whole Christmas. We were planning for 3 or 4 months, and we took Christmas Day off, basically. And Nigel, all the guys, they were over at the house, like Boxing Day. We're just every single day, like, just gave up Christmas, and it was so important to us that we do it right and that Jennie was happy. Like, it's just a level of commitment and preparedness.
Do you want to speak to that with making Last Days of Ocock, or you?
No,
Okay.
I'm waiting for your next question or for you to say we're all done.
Hint, hint. Any other questions? Go for it, sir.
Sort of not to do with logistics or the technical aspect of it. I'm a complete outsider, know nothing about the business, if you could call it that. It's occurred to me lately that somebody really needs to make some sort of a film, documentary, I suppose, about the mail carriers of Labrador. Now, I don't know if you're looking for subjects, if this means anything at all. A very little bit of research recently has brought in a huge amount of information about how the mail was carried by dog team, right from Blancheblanc to Burwell, up to Cape Chile, basically. And people have all this information they're sitting on. It's not too many generations removed, just a couple. Oh yeah, Dad did that, or Grandfather did this. This was just before airmail came, just before the airplanes. There's some fascinating stuff, stories I've heard, and the names are well remembered. go from Burwell to Hebron for the mail, to get the mail, and then take 30 days to get it back. So.
Do you know what it costs to hire a dog team these days?
You have to actually go to Burwell and Hebron, right? You can do this yourself. I don't know, that's your department.
Has there been a film made on that, Anne?
No, I'm
Okay,
sure
I'll
there
do it.
hasn't been. It's a great
I'll do it.
idea. They're
Yeah,
all
I'm
dead.
doing
They're
it.
all dead. That's your first problem. That's your first problem.
There's a huge amount of.
Yeah, I know there is.
Their
There
families
is.
aren't,
Yeah, their
aren't
families
though?
are, yeah.
because
Families are, yeah.
my grandfather and my great-grandfathers were mail carriers on dog teams.
Are
Yeah,
they dead?
yeah, they're dead, but I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah.
That's a good idea, and there's no shortage of good ideas.
Yeah. I
There's
figured
a-
that. This is, you know.
Did you see the map that someone created? Did you create that? Was that you?
Yeah.
Yeah. That,
Take it. Use it.
okay, I'm gonna do it.
We can.
As long
have-
as there wasn't
yeah,
one made about it already,
Hasn't been.
There
because
hasn't been,
I only
no.
want to make
Positive.
films that have never been
100%.
made.
You were talking about this earlier, you know, there's so much about Barry Crystal going here and Mina Hubbard going there and everything else. But the mail service on the coast is all Labradorians.
Yep, yeah, exactly.
My family, my grandfathers, my great
What's
grandfathers.
his name?
Williams is Mugford's, like all Meshers.
Henry John.
Yeah, Henry John Williams.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my family.
Take the map, I'll send it to you.
Yeah. All right.
Maybe we need a pitch session sort of afterwards.
I'd love to do it.
Just had one.
Yeah.
And I want to go on the dog team. I want to do exactly what
Well,
they did.
I mean, Dave also, it's your dad's journal, right? He's got the fascinating, like,
Oh, yes.
yeah, the story in there is,
That's available.
Yeah.
Let's chat.
Yeah.
anything else? You are free to go.
Well, we want to
Thank
draw
you.
for a free book.
Oh, yes, you're right, sorry.
We want to draw for a free book.
Yes, exactly. But do you have the bucket?